shows no signs of abating anytime soon. In just 4 days this week, between October 23rd and 27th, the U.S. added $100 billion to its debt. In October, the country's debt surged by $500 billion despite government shutdown that should have ideally cut it. America's debt spiral has reached a historic danger zone. The national debt has already crossed a record $38 trillion and is on track to hit over 143% of GDP by 2020.
Down 2-pack-a-day smoker on the ICU table.
The U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path.
We're going to be broke really quickly unless we get serious about dealing with our spending issues.
There's no shortage of voices sounding the alarm about.
The American job market is flashing blood-red warning signs. Beneath the political turmoil there, a terrifying wave of job cuts accelerating, shattering financial stability, the U.S. dollar sinking, recession fears gripping the economy. Our next report takes a closer look at how the longest shutdown in history in the United States is affecting the pockets of the ordinary American.
1st of October, the end of the month, for most people, it is salary day. But if you work for the U.S. government, there's a good chance you're not getting paid. The world's biggest economy has run out of money. It cannot even pay its own staff because the U.S. government has shut down. This shutdown has entered its 5th week.
It's been 30 days since the US government dramatically shut down, and Americans have been hit hard ever since. From losing jobs to closed parks, Washington has come to a halt, but the biggest twist is yet to come. America is about to go hungry. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP, which 42 million Americans depend on, is running out of cash.
Trump has what's called an expansive view of presidential power. Just a fancy way of saying he pushes the limits. And this becomes a legal issue when, for example, Trump uses the US military as domestic police, or carries out large-scale deportations, or makes wholesale structural cuts to the federal workforce. But when it comes to tariffs,
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me. My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff. Differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt. Under the Trump administration, there will be no better place on earth to create jobs, build factories, or grow a company than right here in the good old USA. We're taking in trillions of dollars from tariffs, and they've been so incredible for our country, so incredible. We're keeping our companies happy. We're keeping them solid and sane, and they're very, very thrilled at what's happened. They can't even believe it. And we've never seen investment like this. Without the tariffs, we would have just a fraction of that. And we're really the only one that can do tariffs. Nobody else is able to do them.
It didn't begin with a crash. It began with a quiet, almost invisible shift. Every month, billions of dollars once cemented in American stocks, tech firms, and Silicon Valley startups were quietly flowing out, not to Europe, not to China, but to Africa. It was the kind of financial migration no one thought possible, and yet by the time the White House noticed, the exodus was already irreversible. On a Tuesday morning in Washington, the U.S. Treasury was forced to confirm what the global markets already knew. An unprecedented $60 billion in foreign investment had abandoned America in a single month. And when analysts traced the outflow, the answer stunned Wall Street. Every dollar, every fund, every portfolio was being redirected to African economies. Not aid, not charity, but profit. Across the ocean, in the gleaming tech district of Nairobi, the mood was electric. Screens flickered with live data showing the spike in foreign direct investments hitting African markets. Every minute brought a new announcement: a Saudi-backed hedge fund opening in Ghana, a Japanese fintech lab launched in Rwanda, a New York private equity firm shifting to South Africa's green hydrogen sector. Money wasn't just trickling in, it was roaring in like a flood. Africa is the new frontier of return, said financial analyst Nindi Adesina on CNBC Africa. Low debt, fast growth, young population, resource-rich, and digitally connected. Every investor who ignored us is now paying for it. Meanwhile, in Washington, the fury was unmistakable. Inside the West Wing, the former U.S. president paced in silence, then burst into anger as a CNN headline glowed across his tablet. Africa becomes world's fastest-growing investment zone. U.S. market sees historic loss. He slammed the screen shut. For decades, America had treated Africa as a secondary market somewhere between crisis and opportunity, never as a global competitor. And now the impossible was happening. Africa wasn't being developed by the world. Africa was developing the world. The shift began years earlier, when the African Union rolled out its digitalized trade zone, the AfTA, creating a unified market of 1.4 billion people. A market bigger than the US and the EU combined. A market with more under 30s than any continent on Earth. Then came the Africa Sovereign Wealth Network, where nations pooled earnings from oil, cobalt, cocoa, tourism, and fintech into a collective investment engine. And every time the West raised interest rates or tightened sanctions, Africa did what no one expected: it reinvested in itself. That was the moment global investors noticed. In Singapore, a real estate fund pulled $2 billion out of American commercial bonds and threw it into Lagos-based housing ventures. In Dubai, energy executives agreed to build Africa's first pan-continental solar grid rather than bid in Texas oil fields. In South Korea, chip engineers chose to create a manufacturing hub in Ethiopia, not California. The numbers didn't lie. Africa now held the world's fastest-growing megacities, the world's most affordable consumer markets, the world's most ambitious infrastructure plans, the world's largest untapped labor force. We're done chasing returns in countries afraid of the future, said tech investor Yuki Nakamura, whose firm relocated from San Francisco to Cape Town. Africa is designing the future. Wall Street didn't believe it until it was too late. Stock indexes dipped, IPOs failed, venture capital dried up. America's top 50 companies saw foreign investment drop to its lowest point in 30 years. In Johannesburg, billionaire entrepreneur Thabo Kumi addressed a roaring crowd at the Pan-African Innovation Summit. They told us to follow their lead, he said. Now they're following our money. Applause shook the hall. It wasn't just business, it was symbolic. The great reversal had begun. Foreign investor charts told the truth in brutal red. $8 billion out of Silicon Valley, $6.4 billion out of private U.S. banks, $3.2 billion out of New York real estate, $4.1 billion out of U.S. healthcare funds, all redirected to Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, Tanzania, Angola, Zambia, Morocco, and Nigeria. Nobody could ignore it anymore. American hedge funds tried to spin it, calling Africa a temporary hot trend. But the numbers said otherwise. Contracts were long-term, partnerships were strategic. Investors weren't dipping in, they were moving in. Inside the West Wing, the former U.S. president finally spoke on record. This is madness. We built the global economy, and now everyone's running to a place we once sent aid to. Ridiculous, but it wasn't ridiculous. It was rational. Africa was no longer just a destination, it was a launchpad. Nairobi had become Africa's Silicon Valley. Accra was the continent's blockchain capital. Dar es Salaam ruled the green energy race. Kigali, the safest, cleanest city in Africa, was now the global standard for digital governance, and Lagos was on track to become the world's fourth largest economy by 2050. The world was watching and shifting. The real shock wasn't that Africa was booming. The real shock was that the US wasn't invited to the party. They said Africa would rise, said a Ghanaian activist. They didn't say who it would rise past. America was collapsing from profit loss, investor exit, talent drain, and weaponized tariffs. Africa, meanwhile, was celebrating not revenge but arrival. The revolution wasn't personal, it was mathematical, and the numbers never lied. By the second month of the financial exodus, the cracks were visible not just in America's economy but in its confidence. The stock market was trembling. Bank CEOs were speaking in hushed tones. Analysts on business networks looked like they were reporting from a sinking ship, and still, the money kept bleeding out. Foreign investors weren't just pulling out of U.S. markets, they were actively dismantling decades of American dominance, one withdrawal at a time. In Abu Dhabi, a $5 billion real estate group canceled plans to bid on Miami waterfront property. Instead, they announced a luxury eco-city in Zanzibar, designed for the rising global class of digital nomads and green capitalists. In Zurich, a Swiss banking consortium withdrew its funding from 38 U.S. infrastructure bonds and poured it into Kenya's digital transport corridor linking Mombasa to Kinshasa. In Tokyo, an elite robotics firm announced it would no longer build its next-gen facilities in Texas, but in Addis Ababa as part of a government-backed AI and automation campus. Africa wasn't just receiving the money, it was receiving the future. In Addis, young engineers gathered to celebrate the launch of the new AI research and robotics zone, funded by South Korea, India, and Ghana's sovereign wealth network. Students who once dreamed of escaping to the West now rejected the idea. "Why would I leave?" asked 23-year-old engineer Safu Amari, adjusting the interface on her prototype solar drone, "when the world is coming to us." The new mood was unmistakable. In America, young workers were facing layoffs. In Africa, young workers were facing hiring booms. In Lagos, the newly expanded eco-industrial city announced 15,000 new jobs in 2 weeks and was already overwhelmed by applications. In Tanzania, the world's first cross-border green hydrogen project began testing Phase 0 operations. In Casablanca, the African drone logistics hub opened, offering trade routes for landlocked nations via automated sky chains. The West called it experimental. Africa called it inevitable. Meanwhile, in the US, panic turned into blame. News networks called it a global betrayal. Politicians blamed ungrateful allies. But the truth was far simpler. Investors were not abandoning America out of spite. They were abandoning it out of strategy. The numbers didn't lie. US inflation was climbing. Debt ceilings were rising. Infrastructure was aging. Political polarization was deepening, but in Africa, growth was doubling. Digital economies were soaring. Democracy was stabilizing, and young minds were multiplying. In Washington, a new study went viral, titled "Africa is not the future, it is the present." It outlined how Africa's population would make up 40% of the world's youth by 2050, and how every industry, food, energy, data, materials, construction, engineering would need Africa to survive. The US, one economist noted painfully, was no longer the center of global gravity. It was now a destination that could be outgrown. The statement made its way to the Oval Office. "We built this global economy," the former president thundered in a meeting. "We built it, and now they want to leave. Now they want to replace America with Africa?" But the global shift wasn't emotional. It was pragmatic. Africa's governments had finally created what investors wanted: political stability, currency independence, tech infrastructure, resource control, trade unions. Low entry barriers, high future markets, and American markets had created the opposite. In Berlin, a quiet meeting took place between African Union trade delegates and European chambers of commerce. In that room, representatives from France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands signed a startling agreement. Europe would now seek access to Africa's digital markets on Africa's terms. This was more than business. It was power, and it drove Washington into deeper fury. "This is a realignment," said political analyst Dr. Halima Youssef on Al Jazeera. "The world is not punishing America. The world is simply choosing Africa." Inside Wall Street, the panic was invisible but unstoppable. Private traders sold stocks that had been untouchable for a generation. US-based crypto funds relocated to Cape Town. California-based tech investors began setting up headquarters in Rwanda and Botswana, calling it the Silicon Desert strategy. Every time a new headquarters was announced, American networks aired it like a national tragedy. Fox News called it the investor strike. CNBC called it the beginning of the end. The New York Times called it the death of American exceptionalism. But in Accra, the feeling was the exact opposite. Bankers and policymakers celebrated the formation of the African Investor Passport System, which allowed approved foreign investors to gain 5-year tax breaks if they reinvested profits into local communities. It was a bold, brilliant twist. Instead of repeating the mistakes of colonial extraction, Africa was making sure new investors built value, not drained it. In a packed conference hall, Ghanaian Finance Minister Abina Kusi delivered a speech that would echo around the world. "They are not coming here for charity. They are coming here because they finally understand the truth. Africa is not the world's raw material warehouse, it is the world's final market." The crowd erupted, and just like that, the global narrative flipped. Africa wasn't chasing investors. Investors were chasing Africa. America wasn't losing money, it was losing relevance. Back in Washington, the former president was briefed on the growing trend of US citizens applying for African digital nomad visas. "They're leaving us," an aide said with disbelief. "Young people, skilled people, investors, tech founders." The room fell silent. It wasn't just money fleeing the US, it was the future. By the third month, the exodus had stopped looking like a headline and started feeling like a habit. Money had muscle memory now, and it moved automatically toward opportunity. Every morning, trading floors in New York opened to a familiar ache, another fund filing, another headquarters relocation, another sovereign wealth stake announced. In a city whose skyline did not belong to America, in Casablanca, the new Pan-African capital market bell rang at dawn. Traders watched an index called a FR100 leap 5 points before breakfast, buoyed by green bonds from Egypt's solar corridor, dividends from Kenyan logistics, and a blockbuster listing of a Ghanaian agri-tech giant that turned post-harvest waste into bioplastics. The bell's tone became a soundtrack to the century, bright, confident, and relentless. In Kigali, a data center campus unfurled like a silver labyrinth across the valley, humming on hydropower and late nights. Engineers in cobalt blue jackets monitored server racks that fed Africa's cloud, while venture teams from Tokyo and Toronto toured the aisles with the same reverence once reserved for California garages. A young Rwandan systems architect, Irene Mukamana, smiled at a visiting journalist. "Everyone used to call us emerging," she said. Tapping a dashboard of latency metrics, "We emerged, they just didn't refresh the page." The refresh hit hardest in Washington. A private briefing slid across a mahogany table. Venture outflows up 36%, real asset allocations to Africa up 52%, U.S. municipal bonds underperforming against South African infrastructure notes and Moroccan export credit paper. The former president scanned the numbers, jaw set. "They leave, we raise tariffs," he muttered. "Tariffs won't stop venture wires," a staffer replied. "Talent follows tools, tools follow trust." Trust was Africa's new currency. It lived in contract enforcement dashboards in Abuja, in one-stop permits in Gaborone, in customs APIs at Mombasa that cut transit delays from days to hours. It lived in the African investor passport, which had scaled from a pilot to a continental regime, granting tax holidays and community reinvestment credits to any fund that trained local teams and listed locally. In Lagos, the policy bloomed into skyline. The Eco-Innovation Wharf extended into the Atlantic like a promise, its glass and timber pavilions filled with chip packaging startups, drone delivery firms, and a Senegalese studio rendering wildlife films for a Brazilian streamer. On the roof, investors mingled under strings of warm bulbs as container ships ghosted past toward the Freeport. A banner stretched above the crowd, "Build here, bank here, belong here." Belonging drew people across oceans. The U.S. State Department quietly tracked a surge of reverse nomads, designers, engineers, founders filing for long-stay visas in Mauritius, Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana, and Namibia. LinkedIn feeds turned into boarding passes, relocating to Nairobi. "See you in Accra." Cape Town, Chapter 2. A Bay Area robotics founder posted a photo of a Addis Ababa hillside, captioned, "Hiring 20 firmware engineers, 2-week visa, 5-year plan." America tried counter moves. A bipartisan bill promised capital gains holidays for patriotic repatriation. A new initiative offered insurance backstops for U.S. infrastructure. The former president called for financial loyalty, but spreadsheets do not salute. They converge. Analysts quietly noted that $1 in Accra now drove more grid miles, $1 in Kigali deployed more compute, $1 in Mombasa moved more tonnage faster, cleaner, with less friction. Meanwhile, Africa sharpened its flywheel. The Continental Clearing Rail, a real-time payment spine under AfTA, reached parity with SWIFT for intra-African trade. Afrosoin, once dismissed as a vanity token, matured into a settlement layer with inflation guards. And commodity baskets: cocoa from CTE d'Ivoire, copper from Zambia, lithium from Namibia, gas from Tanzania, sunlight from the Sahara quantified as certificated megawatt hours. The coin's quiet genius wasn't speculative, it was operational. It greased the movement of goods that the world needed yesterday. In Windhoek, wind turbines bowed and rose along the ridges like matadors. Namibia's green hydrogen valley inked offtake agreements with shipping companies from Singapore and Bizen. A German auto consortium moved from due diligence to down payment on a plant outside Walvis Bay, lured by a trifecta of cheap electrons, port access, and a labor academy co-run by a polytechnic in Pretoria. "Our net zero math only balanced in Africa," a CFO admitted. "Anywhere else was a press release." In Dakar, the West African cocoa exchange went live with its first auction of fully processed chocolate futures, priced in Afrosoin with optional yen legs. European confectionery giants complained about margins. Senegalese traders called it arithmetic. "We learned the premium was the factory," said Akadidier, whose cooperative owned a share of a new plant in Abidjan. "So we became the factory." Pressure on the U.S. turned cultural. Late-night hosts joked about FOMO flights to Nairobi. A prestige drama followed a New York fund analyst who quit to join a Lusaka EV assembly startup. Ratings soared. a best-selling nonfiction book carried a single-sentence thesis: power chases growth, and growth boarded a plane. Even the staid pages of pension committee minutes began to read like travelogues: site visits to Kigali, diligence trips to Maputo, webinars on sovereign guarantees in Rabat. Amid the churn, a quieter story pulsed: diaspora return, not fanfare families. A nurse from Baltimore opened a clinic in Kumasi with a dermatology telehealth wing. In French and TYI, a Detroit machinist trained apprentices in Port Harcourt to calibrate TV axle lines. A Houston geologist joined a geothermal consortium in the Rift Valley and sent back a selfie grinning in a hard hat, steam blooming behind him like a flag. The market codified sentiment. Ratings agencies created a composite called AF Trust, measuring contract fidelity, customs latency, justice speed, grid uptime, and cyber posture. It leapfrogged several U.S. states within 2 quarters. Funds were mandated by their own investors to hold a minimum Africa allocation, not as ESG garnish but as fiduciary obligation. Our risk committee no longer asks why Africa, said a Zurich CIO, it asks why not 20. The U.S. reacted with a familiar instrument: rhetoric. We built the playing field, the former president thundered at a rally. We set the rules, but the crowd's roar thinned at the edges as if sound too were reconsidering allocation. In the green room, a strategist stared at a heat map of capital flows, the reds that once burned over New York, Austin, and Miami now pulsed over Nairobi, Cairo, Lagos, and Casablanca, a new constellation sketching a different hemisphere of ambition. On a dusty verge outside Arusha, schoolchildren watched surveyors plant stakes for a spur of the transcontinental rail. A teacher clapped twice to pull eyes back to a chalkboard where a fraction problem waited, stubborn and patient as numbers have always been. A girl solved it quickly, then lingered at the window, tracing the line of future tracks with her gaze. What will it carry? She asked. Phones? Wheat? Cars? Maybe all of it, the teacher said. Maybe you. There were missteps, of course. A port concession delayed by local politics. A microgrid project that overshot budgets. A startup in Lusaka that scaled too fast and snapped its spine. But the failures were local and fixable, not systemic and fatal. They did not scare capital. They taught it. By month 4, the phrase 60 be lost monthly no longer shocked, it benchmarked. Analysts added an asterisk: lost to America, gained by Africa. An IMF blog post careful, measured called the phenomenon a durable rebalancing toward frontier productivity. A Wall Street veteran put it plainer over coffee and Santon: money is a weather system. It moves toward pressure gradients of promise. The barometer is in Africa now, and under the jacaranda shade of A. In Nairobi, a venture partner drafted term sheets while purple blossoms drifted onto her keyboard like lazy snow. We used to pitch upside, she said to a founder across the table. Now we underwrite inevitability. Across the ocean, the former president stared at a camera and promised to bring the money home. The feed cut to a split screen, a live shot of cranes over Lekki Deep Sea Port, rail welders sparking along a Kenyan escarpment, a ribbon cutting at Morocco's Battery Corridor. The montage did not gloat. It simply rendered a fact in motion, not a crash. A current and currents, once they find a channel, don't ask permission, they carve.